A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. When you hear a siren at 3 in the morning, your brain doesn't just process a sound. It isn't like hearing a car alarm or a loud television. It is a profound, instantaneous neurological event. The second that frequency hits your ear, your amygdala, that ancient almond-sized alarm bell in your brain, hijacks everything. It doesn't matter if you were in a deep REM cycle or just drifting off. Within milliseconds, your prefrontal cortex is offline, your heart rate is redlining, and your system is flooded with a chemical cocktail designed for one thing: survival. But here is the problem. Evolution designed that response for a tiger jump, something that lasts a few minutes. We are now 6 weeks into this conflict between Israel and Iran, and for millions of people, that 3 a.m. siren hasn't been a one-off event. It has been the baseline.
It is the shift from acute to chronic, Corn. That is the threshold we have crossed. In the medical literature, we often talk about the 12-day window, like the conflict we saw last summer, as something the human psyche can sprint through. You can run on adrenaline for 12 days. You don't sleep well, you're jumpy, but you're still in that emergency mode where the body is prioritizing immediate action. But 42 days, 6 weeks, that is where the biology changes. We are moving out of the acute stress phase and into what's known as chronic adaptation territory. Your brain is literally rewiring itself to stay in that high alert state permanently because it no longer believes the environment is safe enough to ever stand down.
And that is exactly what Daniel wanted us to dig into today. He sent over a note about the reality on the ground right now, and honestly, it's heavy. He wrote, "Let's examine how those living in conflict zones can resettle their nerves. We'll focus on civilians in Israel, Iran, and elsewhere in the Middle East whose normal lives have been upended for the past 6 weeks, living from siren to siren. This constant hypervigilance takes a toll on parents and children, and 6 weeks is much longer than the previous 12-day war last summer. We also need to discuss the fallout of trust. There's a sentiment shared by Yair Lapid today that the Israeli government was asleep at the wheel in updating civilians and has let the country down. Where do people go from here? There is a lull in hostilities, but few are optimistic that it will be anything other than a fleeting respite."
There is so much in that prompt. The biological toll is massive, but that fallout of trust Daniel mentions is the second-order disaster. When the physical environment is unstable, you look to institutions for a sense of predictive coding. Basically, you need someone to tell you what's coming so your brain can stop guessing. If that trust breaks, the hypervigilance gets even worse because now you're scanning for threats from the sky and DOS scanning for lies from your own leadership.
It's the ultimate my weird prompts scenario, because it's where deep neurobiology meets messy real-world geopolitics. And just a quick heads up for everyone listening, today's exploration is actually being powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It's the model writing our script today, which feels fitting given we're talking about complex systems and predictive models. But Herman, before we get into the politics, I want to stick with that 3 a.m. siren. Why is the 6-week mark so different from the 2-week mark? What is actually happening to a person's nerves at this stage?
At 6 weeks, you aren't just tired, you are experiencing adrenal exhaustion and a fundamental shift in your HPA axis. That's the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands. Usually they work on a feedback loop. Stress happens, cortisol rises, you deal with the threat, and then a shutoff signal is sent. But when the threat is siren to siren for 42 days, the shutoff valve breaks. You lose the ability to return to what we call the ventral vagal state, the state of social engagement and calm. You're stuck in the sympathetic nervous system's on position.
So, even during this fragile lull, we're seeing after the ceasefire, people aren't actually resting. Their bodies are just waiting for the next hit.
Precisely. The quiet becomes a different kind of threat because it's unpredictable. Your brain starts interpreting silence as the eye of the storm, which can actually be more taxing than the sirens themselves.
We've got a lot to unpack here, from the way parents are passing this stress to their kids through mirror neurons, to the specific ways people are trying to resettle when the world still feels like it's vibrating. Let's dive into the mechanics of this 6-week breaking point.
It really is a breaking point. When you look at the physiology, we're talking about a state of sustained sympathetic nervous system activation without any meaningful parasympathetic recovery. In plain English, the fight or flight response is stuck in the on position, and the rest and digest system, the parasympathetic branch, can't get a word in edgewise. Usually, after a threat passes, your body initiates a recovery phase to repair tissues and balance hormones. But when you're living siren to siren for 6 weeks, that recovery never completes. You're essentially stacking stress on top of unrecovered stress.
And that's the difference between this and the 12-day conflict from last summer, right? You can white-knuckle your way through 12 days on pure adrenaline. It's a sprint. But 6 weeks? That's a marathon run at a sprint pace. Your body eventually just starts cannibalizing its own resources.
And this is where the fallout of trust, Daniel mentioned, becomes a physiological factor, not just a political one. Humans are prediction machines. Our brains are constantly trying to model the future to reduce uncertainty, because uncertainty is metabolically expensive. When Yair Lapid talks about the government being asleep at the wheel, he's describing a total breakdown of the social contract. If you can't trust the official sirens, or the official updates, or the political leadership to have a plan, your brain can't build a reliable predictive model.
So the hypervigilance actually intensifies because you've lost your external anchor. You're not just scanning the skies for Iranian drones, you're scanning the news for signs that your own leaders are failing you again. It's a double layer of threat detection that never sleeps. It's like trying to navigate a minefield while the person holding the map is admitted they're lost.
That's a perfect way to frame it. The social contract in a conflict zone isn't just about taxes and laws, it's a promise of shared reality and protection. When that breaks, the individual's nervous system has to take on the entire burden of survival. That is what leads to the profound exhaustion Daniel is sensing across the region right now. And if you look at the neurobiology of that burden, it all centers on the amygdala. After 6 weeks of intermittent sirens, the amygdala isn't just on high alert, it's effectively undergone a structural change called long-term potentiation. Basically, the neural pathways that detect threat have been paved into high-speed expressways. This creates what we call a conditioned anticipatory anxiety state. Your brain stops reacting to the siren itself and starts reacting to this possibility of the siren.
So the quiet isn't a break, it's just a countdown. I've been reading about these siren dreams coming out of Tel Aviv where families are reporting waking up in a panic because they heard a phantom alarm in their sleep. Their brains are literally simulating the threat to make sure they aren't caught off guard. It's like the hardware is running a diagnostic loop that it can't exit.
That's a great way to put it. Those siren dreams are a clear indicator that the threat detection system has become decoupled from actual external stimuli. And the physiological cost of that is mediated by the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. In a 12-day conflict, like we saw last summer, you get these acute spikes of cortisol. It's intense, but it's a spike and recovery pattern. After 6 weeks, the pattern flattens into a sustained elevation. Your baseline cortisol level stays high around the clock.
Which explains why sleep doesn't actually restore anything. You can lay in bed for 8 hours, but if your cortisol is redlining, your brain never enters the deep restorative REM cycles. You wake up just as biologically depleted as when you laid down.
You hit the nail on the head. In fact, we see this exact same cortisol signature in military personnel who have been in sustained combat operations for 4 to 6 weeks. At the 12-day mark, they're still wired. By week 6, they're entering adrenal fatigue. The system starts to malfunction. One of the most maladaptive shifts is in the startle response. Normally, your brain is very good at filtering out white noise, a door slamming, a motorcycle backfiring, but after 6 weeks of sirens, that filter vanishes. Every loud noise is processed by the brain as a potential missile impact until proven otherwise.
It's the ultimate trade-off. Your brain decides that the metabolic cost of 1,000 false alarms is cheaper than the cost of missing the one real one, but the human body isn't built to sustain that kind of hypervigilance for 42 days. You start seeing tissue-level changes. Inflammation markers go up. The immune system suppressed. We aren't just tired. We're physically degrading under the weight of the alert.
And when you add the collapse of institutional trust into that mix, you've removed the only thing that could signal the all clear to the amygdala. If the government can't be trusted to tell you when you're safe, your brain assumes you're never safe.
That loss of a reliable all clear is exactly where the secondary trauma starts bleeding into the next generation. We're seeing these reports from both Tel Aviv and Tehran of parents who physically cannot stop scanning the horizon or checking their phones, even during this ceasefire lull. And because of mirror neurons, children are picking up on that static. If a parent's nervous system is screaming danger through their body language, a child can't co-regulate. They don't just see the war, they feel their parent's vibration of it.
The technical term for that is co-regulation failure. A child relies on the caregiver's stable nervous system to reset their own, but after 6 weeks the caregivers are depleted. This actually ties into a fascinating breakdown in what we call the brain's predictive coding model. Normally, your brain builds an internal map of the world to predict what happens next, so it doesn't have to process every single detail from scratch. When the government's warnings or the siren apps don't match the lived reality, like when Lapid talks about the state being asleep at the wheel, that predictive model shatters.
It's like the software update was corrupted. If the official word says you're safe, but your eyes see a drone, or your ears hear an explosion the government didn't warn you about, your brain stops trusting external data entirely. You revert to a permanent internal state of red alert because the external environment has become fundamentally unpredictable.
And that's why this current lull is so paradoxical. For many, the quiet is actually more taxing than the sirens. During active conflict, the threat is visible. You have a protocol: run to the shelter, wait for the boom, come out. But in a fragile ceasefire, the threat is invisible and unpredictable. Your brain is stuck in a high-cost searching mode. We see this in Iranian civilian reports too. Even without an Iron Dome, the psychological response is identical. The lack of state protection there has created a sense of total abandonment, which forces the individual's nervous system to work overtime because there's no herd protection to lean on.
So we aren't just talking about recovering from stress anymore. We're talking about a forced adaptation to a high-threat baseline. Recovery implies you go back to who you were before the 42 days started. Adaptation means your brain has rewritten its operating system to survive a world where the next 90 seconds could be your last. Resettling those nerves isn't about just getting a good night's sleep. It's about convincing the amygdala that the world is actually a predictable place again. And when the political leadership is viewed as a failure, that's a very hard sell for the lizard brain.
It is a hard sell, but there are specific, evidence-based protocols that can at least interrupt that loop so it doesn't become a permanent neurological scar. One of the most effective tools for this is the 90-second rule for a nervous system reset. When you're in that state of hypervigilance, your sympathetic nervous system is essentially redlining. To force a shift back to the parasympathetic side, you have to use a physical override. The 4-7-8 breathing pattern is the gold standard here because it literally signals to the vagus nerve that the immediate threat has passed.
I've seen that one. You inhale for 4, hold for 7, and exhale for 8, right? It sounds almost too simple when you're talking about a 6-week war, but the physics of it are what matter. You're forcing the heart rate to slow down by extending the exhale. It's like hitting the manual override on a car that's stuck in a high gear. If you can get someone to do that for 90 seconds, you can often break the immediate spike of a panic response before it cascades into a total meltdown.
And for those who feel like their entire environment has become a source of trauma, another critical tool is what we call predictability anchors. When the macro environment, the government, the sirens, the geopolitical situation is completely unpredictable, the brain needs micro routines it can absolutely rely on. This could be something as small as a specific 3-minute coffee ritual at the exact same time every morning, or a tactile grounding exercise before bed. These anchors provide the predictive coding model with a win. They give the brain a small data point that says, I predicted this would happen, and it did.
It's about shrinking the world down to a size you can actually manage. If you can't trust the Homefront Command or the political updates from the Prime Minister's office, you have to find something you can trust, even if it's just the temperature of your morning tea. For parents especially, focus on somatic grounding. If you're vibrating with anxiety, your kids are going to mirror that. You don't have to pretend the war isn't happening, but you can use physical touch weighted blankets, firm pressure on the shoulders, or even just sitting with your back against the solid wall to give your body a sensory message of stability that the environment isn't providing.
That somatic piece is vital because the lizard brain doesn't process logic, it processes sensation. If your feet feel heavy and grounded on the floor, your amygdala receives a safe enough signal. For listeners in these zones, or anyone supporting them, the goal isn't to reach a state of peace. That's impossible right now. The goal is regulated alertness. You want to be able to respond to a siren without your nervous system shattering in the process. It's about building a buffer so that when the next 42 days come, or the next lull ends, you have at least a little bit of internal structural integrity left to lean on.
That idea of internal structural integrity is really what it comes down to when the external structures, the government, the warning systems, the social contract, have essentially buckled. It leads to a pretty heavy question, though. Can trust in these institutions ever truly be rebuilt once that physiological stress response has already been triggered by their failure? If your body has spent 6 weeks learning that the people in charge are asleep at the wheel, as Lapid put it, does a ceasefire actually fix that? Or is the cellular memory of that abandonment permanent?
It's a massive challenge for any society. When the predictive coding of the brain is repeatedly met with error signals, meaning the government says you're safe, but then a siren goes off, or they promise a strategy that never materializes, the brain eventually stops updating the model. It just stops trusting the input. Long term, that leads to a population that is permanently decoupled from its leadership. We might see a future where the baseline stress levels of millions of people in Israel and Iran never actually return to pre-2026 levels. They might just exist at a higher state of simmering alert for the rest of their lives.
Which is a sobering thought for what happens when this conflict eventually, hopefully, ends. The physical buildings get rebuilt, but the neural pathways are a lot harder to patch up. It's something we're going to be watching closely as this fragile lull plays out. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for pulling the threads together on this one.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the back end of this show.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you found this deep dive into the neurobiology of conflict helpful, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach more people who might need these insights.
We'll be back soon. Stay safe out there.
See ya. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth